She called me a dusty relic in front of the appraiser, holding my own painting as if it were a curiosity dug up from the ruins of someone else's life. I remember the way the light came through the curtains that afternoon, thin, unforgiving, like truth. The man she had brought with her, the appraiser, nodded politely, hiding his smile behind professional restraint. I stood by the window, hands trembling only slightly, watching as she tilted the canvas toward him and said, "We just want to clear some space before she moves to the smaller unit. You know how it is with old people. They hold on to everything." The word everything floated in the air like dust itself, settling on the worn carpet and the corners of the room where my life had quietly gathered over decades. I wanted to tell her that those canvases were not clutter. They were the map of my years, the breath of a woman who had once been fearless with color. But instead, I smiled the way old women are expected to smile, softly, apologetically, as if existing were an inconvenience. I am 78. I live in a small apartment outside Santa Fe, the kind with beige walls and sliding doors that squeak each time I open them. My days have shrunk into rituals: coffee with too much cream, morning news at low volume, the smell of turpentine that never quite leaves the room even though I haven't painted in years. Sometimes, when the light is right, I still see the ghost of my younger self standing before an easel in a sunlit studio, her wrists smudged with pigment, her eyes fierce with belief. Back then, the world was wide and indifferent, but at least it noticed me. Now, it only notices the silence I leave behind when I go to bed early. The woman who called me a relic is my daughter-in-law, Victoria. She has the kind of poise that photographs well: sleek hair, pearl earrings, that perpetual hint of disdain worn like a perfume. When she married my son, Daniel, 25 years ago, I told myself I would learn to like her, even admire her ambition. She was studying art history then, fluent in the language of critique, all theory and posture. I was proud in my way. I thought she might see in me something worth preserving. Instead, she saw a warning. She saw the ghost of a woman who'd tried and failed to make her name in the same world Victoria planned to conquer with charm and credentials. I should have known then that no matter what I painted, she would always see dust. That afternoon, when they arrived with boxes and polite smiles, I had already brewed tea and laid out a plate of biscuits, thinking we would talk about family matters, perhaps the grandchildren, or Daniel's new firm. But the conversation never turned toward warmth. It was all logistics: what to keep, what to sell, what to donate. They said they were helping me, that I shouldn't strain myself, that the apartment was too full of old memories. "You'll feel lighter," Victoria said, her voice smooth as varnish. "You'll be free of all this clutter." I wanted to tell her that freedom and emptiness are not the same thing, but I bit my tongue until I could taste the metallic edge of restraint. She picked up one of my earliest works, a portrait of a woman whose face seemed to fracture under light, half serene, half shattered, and she laughed softly. "You were so dramatic," she said. "It's actually kind of haunting in a retro way." The appraiser made a note on his clipboard. I stood very still. That painting was the first thing I ever sold under my own name. The buyer had been a small gallery owner who said it captured a woman on the edge of becoming. I suppose I have been on that edge my whole life. After they left, the walls looked naked, embarrassed. I sat in my chair by the window and stared at the space where the painting had hung for nearly 40 years. The hooks still clung to the plaster, like tiny open mouths. I could hear their voices in the hallway, laughing as they loaded the car. The sound faded, but its echo stayed. A low hum of humiliation that wrapped itself around my ribs. For the first time in decades, I realized how completely I had vanished from their story. I was not even the artist anymore, not even the mother, just a tired body waiting for smaller rooms, shorter sentences, quieter days. I met Daniel later that week for lunch at a cafe he liked. One of those sterile places where every surface gleamed and the salads had names longer than the people ordering them. He looked good, successful, comfortable in his suit. I tried to tell him how it felt to see my life packed away like donations, but he waved it off gently, the way men do when they want to end a subject without looking cruel. "Mom," he said, "Vic's just trying to help. You've got to admit, you don't really need all that stuff. Besides, you should be flattered. Someone might finally appreciate your work." I asked him what he meant. He smiled, distracted, checking his phone. "She's thinking of submitting a few pieces to the charity auction next month. It's for a good cause. Exposure, you know?" I almost laughed. Exposure. After a lifetime of standing in the cold, he was offering me more of it. When I got home that evening, the apartment felt wrong, lighter in the way a body feels light after a wound has taken something vital away. I walked from room to room, touching the empty spaces where canvases once stood. I remembered the nights I painted by lamplight, while Daniel slept in the next room and the desert wind rattled the windows. I remembered mixing ochre and sienna with trembling precision, trying to catch the color of grief before it dried. Every painting was a confession, every brushstroke a pulse. I didn't paint for fame. I painted because silence frightened me more than failure. But I suppose time has a way of erasing purpose until all that's left is evidence without meaning. In the mirror above the sink, I saw a woman whose hair had turned to silver, whose skin bore the map of years, but whose eyes still flickered with something alive, something not yet willing to be catalogued or dismissed. I thought of Victoria's hand gripping the frame, her voice saying, "Dusty relic," and I felt a strange calm settle over me. Let them think I'm relic dust. Dust remembers every touch. It clings to what matters. It settles only where it chooses. That night, I dreamed of my old studio in Taos, the smell of linseed oil, the warmth of light pooling on unfinished canvases, the soft scrape of brush on linen. I woke before dawn, the desert air cool against my skin, and made coffee. Outside, the sky was opening itself to morning, pink and indifferent. Somewhere, my paintings were stacked in the trunk of my son's car, being driven toward someone else's definition of worth. I imagined them breathing in the dark, waiting. Art has patience. It waits for truth to return. I didn't know it then, but that moment, the insult, the quiet theft, the laugh that followed, was the beginning of my resurrection. Betrayal, when it comes dressed in good intentions, takes a while to recognize. But once you do, there's no unseeing it. And once you stop begging to be seen, the world begins, for the first time, to look back at you differently. I finished my coffee and looked at my hands, still steady, still capable. I thought, perhaps I should start painting again. Not for auctions or approval, but for the simple, defiant pleasure of color. For the proof that I am still here. Then I laughed softly to myself, because that was the cruelest irony of all. Victoria had come to erase me, but she had only managed to wake me up. The defining betrayal didn't arrive with thunder. It came with a phone call, smooth and practiced, the kind of tone people use when they've already decided what's best for you. It was Victoria again, 2 weeks after the visit, her voice syrupy with concern. She said they'd gone through the paintings and found that one or two might have some modest value. She used that phrase, modest value, as though she were describing a yard sale trinket rather than the decades of my inner life made visible in color and form. She told me she had submitted them for assessment through one of her art world contacts, purely as a gesture of goodwill. "You deserve to be recognized, even a little," she said. Even a little. I heard the sound of my own breath steadying, the pause of someone who's been patronized for so long she can no longer tell where gratitude ends and humiliation begins. I thanked her politely, because politeness is armor, and hung up the phone with hands that didn't shake until afterward. For the rest of that week, I couldn't concentrate on anything. The radio muttered the same headlines. The kettle boiled dry once because I forgot it, and the light in the apartment felt harsher than usual, as if it were interrogating me. I told myself I didn't care what she did with those canvases, that art was meant to leave its maker eventually. But there was a weight in my chest, the kind that comes when something sacred is handled by the wrong hands. It wasn't about money or reputation. It was about the quiet cruelty of being repackaged without consent. I spent hours staring at the single remaining canvas I hadn't let them take, an unfinished landscape of the desert after rain. It looked raw and half-remembered, like the mind of someone trying to return to herself. I had painted it in 1982, during a period when my husband still believed my art was a hobby and not a rebellion. He's long gone now, his voice still echoing sometimes in the corners of silence, reminding me how a woman's talent could be dismissed simply by calling it indulgent. I thought I'd buried that version of myself, the one who apologized for taking up space. But betrayal has a way of digging up old graves. When the notice came about the auction, it didn't come to me. It came to a friend of mine, Clara, who used to own a gallery in Santa Fe and still keeps an eye on local events. She called one evening, her voice sharp with disbelief. "Martha, are you aware your work is being listed at the Whitestone benefit auction next week?" I nearly dropped the receiver. "My work," she said. She read aloud from the event's online catalog, describing the lot as anonymous female artist, circa 1970s, expressionist portrait titled Fractured Woman. My breath caught. That was mine. My first real painting, the one Victoria had ridiculed. The one that had once hung above my kitchen table like a silent witness to everything that came after. I asked Clara to send me the link. She did. And there it was. My painting, my colors, my brushstrokes, cataloged as if I were a ghost, my name stripped from it like it had never belonged to me. Estimated value, $1,000 to $2,000. Proceeds to benefit a charity Victoria served on the board of. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, reading and rereading the description until the words blurred. It was a theft wrapped in philanthropy, a perfect crime of good taste. I could almost hear her voice rehearsing the story she would tell, how she'd discovered an overlooked piece from a forgotten artist, how she'd given it new life by donating it for a noble cause. I imagined the approving smiles, the polite applause, and I, the dusty relic, would be thanked posthumously while still alive. There are insults too elegant to scream about. This was one. That night, I opened my old portfolio, the one with curled edges and faint coffee stains. Inside were photographs of exhibitions from decades ago, small shows in Taos, Albuquerque, and once even Denver. I flipped through the pages and saw my name typed on yellowed flyers. Martha Ellison, New Works, 1974. The font was crooked, the ink faded, but it was proof. Proof that I had existed in color before they reduced me to beige. I spent the next morning making copies, scanning every record, every receipt, every photograph. Something had woken up inside me. Not rage exactly, but clarity. That slow and patient fire that older women know how to tend without letting it show. When Daniel called later that day, his tone was different. Less patient, more perfunctory. He said he hoped I wasn't upset about the auction, that it was for charity, that I'd be proud to know my painting could help fund scholarships for underprivileged kids. He spoke as if I were a stubborn child refusing to share her toys. I told him I was happy to help, but I asked if the catalog could be corrected to list me as the artist. There was a pause, long enough to tell me that the question itself was inconvenient. "Mom, that's complicated," he said. "The way the donation paperwork was filed, it's just cleaner if it stays anonymous. You wouldn't want any tax confusion or legal mess, right?" Cleaner, as though erasing me were a form of hygiene. I didn't argue. You can't reason with people who see your identity as an obstacle. I let him talk until he felt absolved, and then I hung up quietly. The days leading up to the auction stretched like thin wire, humming with tension. I couldn't eat. I kept dreaming of that painting hanging on a white wall under artificial light. Strangers leaning in to analyze what I'd once painted in grief. The portrait had been born the night I found out about my husband's affair, though no one ever knew. I painted the woman's face in two halves, one calm, one cracking under invisible pressure. I remember thinking that art could hold pain better than flesh, and now it was out there again, exposed, misunderstood, stripped of its origin. I began to wonder whether the betrayal was theirs or mine, for allowing my work to fall silent so long that someone else could claim its story. The morning of the auction, I woke before dawn and opened the curtains. The desert sky was still ink blue, a single star trembling on the horizon. I felt old and young at once, like the years had folded in on themselves. I thought of my mother's voice, telling me once that women in our family don't burn down houses. They simply leave and let the wind do it. I dressed slowly, in clothes I hadn't worn for years. The navy velvet coat from my first gallery opening, a thin scarf patterned with ochre and indigo, the shades I used to favor before the world dulled me into politeness. I slipped the photographs of my old exhibitions into my handbag, along with a folded envelope that contained the bill of sale from 1974, proof of my authorship. It wasn't defiance that drove me. It was dignity. There comes a point in life when silence stops being noble and starts being surrender. I took the bus into town. No one noticed me. The driver nodded. The young couple in front of me scrolled through their phones. A child behind me hummed to himself. I sat by the window and watched the landscape change. The dusty outskirts giving way to clean storefronts. The forgotten side streets turning into avenues where everything shimmered with new money. When I reached the gallery, I hesitated outside the glass doors. The building was all sharp lines and polished metal, designed to make visitors feel smaller. Through the window, I could see the crowd already gathering, glasses of white wine glinting in their hands, laughter pitched at the frequency of performance. I stepped inside quietly. No one turned to look. Of course they didn't. Old women are invisible until they cause trouble. I stood near the back as the auction began, clutching my bag close, watching each lot come and go. Landscapes, sculptures, bright abstracts, all of them praised in the same syrupy language of value and rarity. And then my painting appeared. The fractured face glowed beneath the lights, the cracks in the paint looking almost deliberate, like new wounds. The auctioneer introduced it with a flourish. A remarkable rediscovery of an anonymous female artist from the 1970s. Raw, emotional, ahead of its time. My heart thudded once, heavy and sure. The bidding started low, then climbed. I watched the numbers rise in dizzying increments until, with a final strike of the gavel, it was sold for $2 million. The room erupted in applause. I didn't move. I just stared at the painting one last time, the colors alive again after years of dormancy, and thought, so this is what it takes to be seen. Death by omission. I slipped out before anyone noticed me. Outside, the air was cold and merciful. I walked 2 blocks before stopping to breathe. My legs trembled, but not from weakness. Something inside me had shifted. An old hinge unstuck. They had tried to erase me, and instead, they had revived me. Betrayal had completed the circle of creation. What they thought was theft was, in its strange way, a resurrection. And I knew then, with the same clarity that comes before the first brushstroke, that I was not finished. Not as a woman, not as an artist, and certainly not as the author of my own name. In the days after the auction, the silence in my apartment changed its shape. It wasn't empty anymore. It was charged, almost electric, like the air just before a storm. The world had moved, though no one around me knew it yet. My painting was gone, my name absent from every announcement, and yet for the first time in years, I felt a pulse of recognition. Private, inward, defiant. I hadn't told anyone I was there that night. I hadn't told Clara, or Daniel, or even the woman at the front desk of my building who liked to gossip about local events. The knowledge of what I had seen, what I had felt, lived only inside me, and it was enough to keep me awake through the nights that followed. Sometimes I would get up at 2 or 3 in the morning and sit by the window, watching the thin desert clouds drift across the sky, my thoughts moving like them, slow, weightless, unable to settle. I didn't know what I wanted to do yet. Part of me wanted to shout, to claim what was mine, to see my name printed in the papers again. But another part whispered that this moment required patience, the kind I had learned only through years of being silenced. I began to notice how differently the days looked once you knew a secret about yourself. At the grocery store, as I walked past the shelves of canned soup and pale fruit, I thought, none of them know who I am. The young cashier, the man bagging lettuce, the woman in line behind me. All of them were part of a world that would soon discover that the old lady who bought cat food and instant coffee was the anonymous artist whose portrait had shocked collectors. It wasn't arrogance, it was something quieter, an awareness that I had been misjudged for so long that vindication itself felt like a form of intimacy. Still, I said nothing. I let the secret breathe. Every day, I expected a call from Daniel, some acknowledgement of what had happened, but none came. Victoria was silent, too, though I imagined her smile tightening when the final price was announced, her plans shifting from charity to calculation. I had known her long enough to recognize how greed moves. It begins as justification, then becomes ownership. I knew she would come eventually, and I decided not to meet her unarmed. So I started preparing, in the quiet way women my age prepare for everything. I pulled out boxes from under the bed, old portfolios, correspondence, exhibition contracts from galleries that had long since closed. I found photographs from the 1970s, black and white, some faded to gray, showing me at openings, smiling in front of my canvases with a glass of cheap wine in hand. In one, I was standing beside Fractured Woman itself, younger by half a century, hair wild, the same determined tilt to my chin that I still felt beneath the wrinkles. I spread these items across the dining table, cataloging them carefully, writing dates in neat columns. My handwriting, though slower, hadn't lost its precision. As I worked, I realized I wasn't just gathering proof for the world. I was reclaiming the chronology of myself. Every document, every scrap of evidence was a breadcrumb leading back to the version of me that had once believed she could carve her name into the noise of the world. When the phone finally rang, I wasn't surprised. It was Daniel. His voice had that polite strain of someone rehearsing concern while masking irritation. "Mom," he began, "we need to talk about something." I told him I was listening. "The painting, you heard about the auction?" I said I had. "It's incredible, isn't it? 2 million. Vic's friends can't believe it. Apparently, the buyer's some major collector from Chicago, very influential. He's trying to track down the artist's identity, says he wants to acquire more pieces from the same era. Crazy, right?" I stayed silent long enough for him to start sounding nervous. "Mom, you there?" I said. "Yes." And then, very evenly, "That artist is me." There was a pause, the kind that splits time. Then he laughed, uncertain, too quickly. "Come on, Mom. I mean, I know you used to paint, but this is professional." His voice trailed off, because even he heard how that sounded. "It is professional," I said quietly. "Because I was a professional." Another pause, longer this time, before he said, "Look, Mom, there's probably some confusion. Let me talk to Vic. We'll figure it out." I told him there was no confusion, that the work was mine, and that I had proof. He didn't answer for several seconds, and when he finally spoke, his tone had changed. "Just don't do anything rash, okay? The collector's lawyers are already in touch with the auction house. It's complicated." Then he hung up before I could reply. I sat with the receiver in my lap, listening to the dial tone dissolve. It wasn't sadness I felt. It was recognition. My son had spent his life mistaking silence for safety, and I had taught him that by example. Every time I'd swallowed anger or softened a truth, I'd been teaching him to ignore me. Now he was fluent in it. But I was done speaking in the polite language of erasure. I stood, stretched my back, and went to the closet for my old leather satchel. I filled it with the documents I'd gathered, placed the photograph of me beside the painting on top, and zipped it shut. I didn't know exactly what my next step would be, but I knew it would be taken on my own terms. The following morning, I received an email, sent from an address I didn't recognize. It was brief and formal, signed by someone from the Whitestone auction house. They had been contacted by the collector, a man named Harris Caldwell, who wished to verify the painting's provenance. "We understand you have a claim to authorship," the message read. "If possible, we would appreciate a meeting to discuss documentation." I read it 3 times, each word sinking into me like a seed. Then I called Clara, told her everything, and asked if she would accompany me. "Of course," she said. "They can't intimidate 2 old women." I smiled for the first time in days. At the meeting, the representative from the auction house, a young man in an expensive suit that didn't quite fit his shoulders, tried to maintain a tone of professional neutrality, but his eyes kept betraying surprise. I laid the documents on the table one by one. The exhibition flyers, the signed receipts, the original photograph. "This is the painting you sold," I said. "It was created in 1974. It has been in my possession ever since, until my daughter-in-law removed it without my permission." He cleared his throat and glanced at his notes. "Mrs. Ellison, this is quite compelling evidence. If you don't mind my asking, why was the piece donated anonymously?" I looked at him steadily. "Because sometimes theft dresses itself in kindness." He blinked, unsure whether to write that down. Clara leaned forward. "You'll be correcting the record publicly, of course?" The man stammered something about procedures and due diligence. I left the building knowing it was done. Once truth enters a system, even reluctantly, it spreads. The days that followed were quieter, but not calm. I knew the news would reach Victoria soon, and I imagined her pacing her immaculate kitchen, calculating how to spin this revelation. For my part, I didn't want vengeance. I wanted restoration. Still, restoration has its own form of vengeance. It shines a light where others have tried to install shadow. I began to paint again, tentatively at first, pulling out small canvases, letting my hands remember the rhythm of brush and color. The first thing I painted was a desert horizon, vast and unbroken, the sky heavy with the kind of light that forgives nothing. Each stroke felt like reclaiming breath. When Victoria finally appeared at my door 3 days later, she was polite, almost rehearsed. She carried a bouquet of lilies, too perfect to be sincere. "Martha," she said, smiling tightly, "we should talk." I let her in. She sat on the edge of the couch, her knees pressed together, her perfume cutting through the air like a question. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she began. I said nothing, waiting. "The auction house is saying you're the artist. It's wonderful, of course, but you have to understand how this looks. The press is asking questions, and Daniel's, well, he's worried. Maybe we can manage this together." The word manage made me laugh. She flinched. "You can't manage what you don't own," I said. "You took something that wasn't yours, and now you're afraid of losing control of the story." She started to protest, but I raised a hand. "Don't bother. I've already spoken to the collector. He knows the truth." The color drained from her face. "You spoke to him?" "He called me himself. He wants to purchase more of my work, under my name." For a moment she looked young, truly young, stripped of her armor of composure. Then she stood abruptly, smoothing her skirt. "I'm glad for you," she said, but her voice cracked on the last word. After she left, the apartment smelled faintly of lilies and panic. I opened the window to let both out. That night, I dreamed again of the auction hall, but this time, I wasn't in the shadows. I stood beneath the lights, surrounded by color, mine, and no one called me a relic. They called me by my name. When I woke, I felt something I hadn't in years: expansion. The quiet was no longer empty. It was waiting, patient, alive, as if the world were finally clearing a space for me to step into it again. I poured myself a cup of coffee, sat at my table surrounded by my old proofs, and thought of how betrayal, like art, is never finished until you decide what it means. And for the first time in a long, long while, I knew exactly what it meant. It meant I was still becoming. The morning the article appeared, I was sitting by the window with my coffee, watching the first dust of sunrise roll across the desert hills. The newspaper was folded neatly on my neighbor's step, and I hadn't planned to buy one until I saw my name printed in black on the front page of the arts section. The Forgotten Visionary. Rediscovered Works of Martha Ellison. For a moment I thought it was a mistake, a coincidence, another woman with my name. But the photograph below the headline erased any doubt. The portrait of the fractured woman stared back at me, luminous and deliberate. Every line of it, mine. I read the article slowly, tracing the words as if they might vanish if I blinked. It spoke of rediscovery, of belated recognition, of how time can obscure genius and then, by some twist of fate, bring it back to light. It mentioned the collector, Mr. Caldwell, who had verified my authorship and was now seeking to acquire more of my early work. There was even a quote attributed to him. Her pieces capture the female psyche not as muse or mystery, but as mirror. She painted women as they truly are, fragmented and whole at once. I set the paper down, my hand trembling only slightly. After so many years of absence, my name had returned to print, and the world had tilted. The phone started ringing that afternoon. Clara called first, her voice bright and breathless, asking if I'd seen it, saying the art circles were already buzzing. Then came messages from old acquaintances, people who hadn't spoken to me in decades, but suddenly remembered my number. Invitations appeared in my inbox, interviews, podcast requests, gallery inquiries. For the first time in half a lifetime, people were saying my name without discomfort or pity. I should have felt vindicated, triumphant even. But what I felt was a kind of delicate disbelief, as though I had been pulled out of sleep too quickly. After a while, I turned off the phone and sat in silence, letting the afternoon light spill over my table where half-finished sketches lay. The world was finally ready to listen, but I wasn't sure I still remembered how to speak in its language. That evening, I began to paint again, not out of ambition, but necessity. The act itself felt like breathing after too long underwater. I found an old canvas leaning against the wall, a half-erased attempt from years ago, and started covering its ghosts with fresh color. My hands were slower now, my lines less certain, but the rhythm was still there, buried deep in muscle and memory. I painted a horizon that refused to stay still, a landscape that seemed to shift as you looked at it. While I worked, I thought of all the years when I had wanted only peace and got invisibility instead. People talk about the cruelty of being forgotten, but there's another kind. The cruelty of being remembered only for your usefulness. The art world was interested again, but part of me knew it wasn't because they suddenly understood my work. It was because money had reminded them it mattered. 2 days later, a letter arrived. It was written on heavy stationery embossed with Caldwell's initials. He thanked me for meeting with his representatives and said he was honored to own one of my earliest works. He wanted to commission a retrospective, a small exhibition of my surviving paintings and sketches, to be held in Chicago within the year. "You've lived long enough," he wrote, "to witness your own return." That line stayed with me, not for its flattery, but for its precision. I had survived long enough to see the world notice what it had once dismissed, and yet part of me wondered whether this return belonged to me or to the myth they would now build from my name. Still, I agreed. I wasn't afraid of exposure anymore. What I feared was shrinking again into the comfort of being unseen. I called Clara that night and told her about the letter. She came over with a bottle of wine, the cheap kind we used to drink when we were both poor and uninvited. We sat by the window, glasses in hand, the air outside humming with summer heat. "You realize this changes everything," she said. I laughed softly. "It changes nothing, and it changes everything. I'm still me, just less invisible." Clara looked at me over the rim of her glass. "They'll come crawling back, you know." I didn't have to ask who she meant. "Let them crawl," I said. "I've stopped living on the floor." The next morning, Daniel called. His voice was stiff, carefully controlled, but I could hear the edges of confusion beneath it. "Mom," he began, "we saw the article. It's..." Impressive. I waited. Look, Vic feels terrible about how things happened. She didn't realize, none of us did, that your work had that kind of value. We just wanted to help. The word help made me close my eyes for a moment. I thought about how many times in my life men had used that word to justify control. I told him calmly that I didn't hold grudges, but that help without respect is just disguised ownership. He tried to pivot, to sound cheerful. Anyway, this is great for all of us. The family name will get some attention, and maybe we can even... I cut him off. No, Daniel. This isn't about the family name. It's about mine. He didn't respond for a long time, and when he finally did, his voice was small. You've changed, he said. I was always this way, I answered. You just never looked closely enough. When I hung up, I felt something settle inside me. A quiet certainty I hadn't felt in decades. I was no longer waiting for recognition from the people who had built their comfort on my silence. The validation that used to seem like oxygen now felt like perfume. Pleasant, unnecessary, and best applied sparingly. I spent the next few days sorting through my remaining paintings, choosing which ones I would send to Chicago. Each piece carried a version of me I had long since outgrown. The hopeful woman, the angry one, the broken one, the one who painted instead of speaking. As I wrapped them in layers of soft paper, I realized I was letting go of them the way a mother releases grown children, grateful, proud, but unwilling to follow them wherever they went. It was during those long afternoons of sorting that something unexpected began to shift. I started receiving letters from strangers, women mostly, some young, some as old as I am, who had read about me and wanted to say thank you. They told me about art classes abandoned for marriage, about poems hidden in drawers, about the shame of wanting to create and the guilt of choosing not to. Their handwriting varied, their stories blurred together, but the refrain was always the same. You made me remember what I was before I was useful. I read them one by one and cried in that quiet, steady way that doesn't leave your face swollen, only lighter. I hadn't known that my survival could be a form of permission for others. One afternoon, as I was cleaning my brushes, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, a woman stood there, young, maybe 30, with hair tied back and a satchel slung over her shoulder. She introduced herself as an art historian from the university. She wanted to interview me for her research on women artists of the 20th century. I invited her in, and we spent hours talking. She asked about my influences, my process, my years of obscurity. But what struck me most was how she listened, not as a journalist mining for quotes, but as a student hungry for truth. When she finally left, she said something that stayed with me. You know, you're not a rediscovery. You're a continuation. That night, I sat at my table with the newspaper still folded beside me and the letter from Caldwell under a cup to keep it from curling. I looked at the desert through the window, the same view I had watched for years while believing nothing would ever change. It looked different now, not because the landscape had shifted, but because I had. Recognition didn't feel like victory. It felt like a mirror. I had been waiting for the world to see me, and all along the world had been waiting for me to step into view. The fear, the invisibility, the quiet years of exile, they weren't wasted. They were the underpainting, the layer beneath the surface that gives depth to the final image. Every artist knows you can't skip that part. When I finally went to bed, the newspaper still lay on the table, the headline bold under the dim light. The Forgotten Visionary. I laughed softly in the dark. I wasn't forgotten. I had simply been quiet too long. And now that the world had remembered me, I wasn't going to let it forget again. Not because I needed applause, but because truth, once recovered, has a duty to remain visible. That was the midpoint of my story, the place where loss turns into direction, where humiliation ripens into clarity. It wasn't triumph that defined it, but the slow, irreversible realization that I no longer needed permission to exist. The past always arrives uninvited, and it rarely knocks before entering. The week after the article's publication, my apartment became a revolving door of phone calls, emails, and polite intrusions masquerading as concern. Collectors wanted interviews. Journalists wanted exclusives. Acquaintances I barely remembered suddenly wanted to reminisce about our shared youth. I had expected some noise, but not the particular frequency of attention that surrounds a woman rediscovered late in life. They spoke to me as if I were both miracle and relic, some exquisite fossil that had learned to talk. At first, I answered them kindly, grateful for curiosity, even flattered by it. But soon, the tone began to shift. The gallery arrangements in Chicago solidified. The auction house issued a formal apology for the misrepresentation of my authorship, and the price of Fractured Woman doubled on the private market. Money, like blood, brings sharks. It started with a letter from Daniel, hand-delivered, as if handwriting could make deceit more intimate. I hadn't seen his handwriting in years. It was steadier than I expected, more deliberate. Inside, 6 pages written in careful blue ink, full of apologies that weren't apologies at all. He wrote that he was proud of me, that the whole family was, and that perhaps, in hindsight, they had been too cautious with my belongings. He said Victoria was mortified by the misunderstanding and hoped I could forgive her. Then the real reason for the letter revealed itself halfway down the 3rd page. He wanted to discuss practical matters, namely, how to protect my newfound assets and ensure that my estate was managed responsibly should anything happen to me. The words estate and responsibly sat on the page like teeth marks. I read the letter twice, not with anger, but with the tired comprehension of someone who has learned to translate false affection into its true tongue, ownership. I didn't respond. Some things do not deserve replies. Instead, I poured myself tea, sat at the table, and reread Caldwell's proposal for the Chicago retrospective. The contract was straightforward. A 6-month exhibit featuring 10 of my works, all under my name, with full proceeds from reproduction rights reverting to me. I had already signed it. I didn't need Daniel's protection. I needed distance. Still, silence has its own gravity, and by refusing to respond, I must have pulled him closer, because 2 days later, he arrived at my door in person. He looked older than I remembered, though I suppose I did too. His hair had thinned, his skin drawn tight around the jaw in that way. Stress carves into men who spend too much time managing rather than feeling. He carried a bottle of wine and an expression of forced cheer. "Mom," he said, stepping inside before I could invite him. "You look great." I thanked him and offered tea. He declined, poured himself a glass from the bottle instead, and sat on the edge of the couch like a man inspecting a property. "Vic sends her love," he said, as though that phrase were currency. I waited. He looked around the room at the paintings stacked against the wall, the sketches pinned to the board. "So this is where it all happened, huh?" The attempt at nostalgia landed wrong. His voice carried the brittle edge of someone trying to make amends without acknowledging the wound. I told him I was busy preparing for Chicago, that the collector had already arranged transport for several works. His eyebrows rose slightly. "You're trusting this guy already?" I smiled. "Trust isn't the word. I'm collaborating." He nodded, sipped his wine, and then leaned forward, the real purpose of his visit unfolding like a bad play. "Mom, I've been talking with some people, lawyers mostly. We think it would be smart to put everything in a family trust. Just in case anything happens, you know. That way there's no confusion later, no outsiders taking advantage." He said the word outsiders the way one might describe thieves or parasites. I looked at him and thought how strange it was that the boy I once taught to hold a paintbrush like a living thing now looked at my work as property to be managed. "There's no confusion, Daniel," I said quietly. "The paintings are mine. The rights are mine. The life is mine. No one's taking advantage of me." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. "You've always been stubborn," he muttered. "You say that as if it's a flaw." "It's not," he said. And I believed him, though not for the reasons he intended. When he left, he kissed my cheek with the awkwardness of guilt. His cologne lingered in the air long after he was gone, expensive and impersonal. The scent of someone who buys apologies by the ounce. I stood by the window and watched him walk to the car. Victoria was waiting inside, her face half hidden behind dark glasses. She didn't wave. The car pulled away, leaving a smear of dust in its wake, and I realized that whatever thread still connected us had frayed beyond repair. The next day, I received an email from Caldwell's assistant confirming the exhibition dates. They wanted me to attend the opening, perhaps say a few words to the press. I agreed. I would not hide from the story of my own resurrection, no matter how uncomfortable it made those who once buried me. I began preparing new works to accompany the old, pieces that spoke not of youth or ambition, but of endurance, of what it means to outlive the people who underestimated you. My brush moved slower now, but with more precision. Each stroke felt like an answer to the unasked question of whether time diminishes or refines. The calls from Daniel continued. At first, I ignored them. Then came messages, each more urgent than the last. "Mom, please call me back. We just need to talk. This could get messy legally." I deleted them all. Then, late one evening, my phone rang again, and this time it was Kieran, my grandson. His voice, still young but deepened by adulthood, cracked slightly as he spoke. "Grandma, are you okay? Dad's been intense about everything. He says people are trying to take advantage of you." I laughed softly. "Sweetheart, people have been trying to take advantage of me my whole life. I've learned to recognize the pattern." He hesitated, then said, "I saw the painting online. It's amazing. I didn't know you were, well, you." I felt a lump rise in my throat. "Neither did they," I said. "But you always did." He didn't answer, but I could hear him breathing, that careful silence of a man who doesn't yet know how to speak tenderness. "I'd like to see you," he said finally, "when you come back from Chicago." "You will," I promised. A week later, the first storm hit. An article appeared in an art blog suggesting that my claim of authorship might have been exaggerated. It quoted an anonymous source close to the family, implying that the provenance was uncertain and that the work might have been collaborative. The tone was insinuating rather than accusatory, but the effect was the same: doubt. I recognized Victoria's phrasing immediately, the way she weaponized politeness to make poison sound reasonable. I didn't respond publicly, but Caldwell did. Within hours, his gallery released a statement affirming my authorship, citing photographic evidence exhibition records, and expert verification. The article was quietly withdrawn 2 days later, but the damage had already been done. Once doubt enters the bloodstream of public opinion, it never fully leaves. I should have felt angry, but what I felt instead was a grim sort of relief. They were showing their hands now. There would be no reconciliation, no gentle understanding. What they couldn't own, they would try to spoil. It was a familiar pattern, as old as motherhood itself. Raise something, nurture it, watch others attempt to claim it the moment it grows beyond their control. The next time Daniel called, I answered. "I know about the article," I said before he could speak. "I know who leaked it." He sighed. "You're being paranoid, Mom. Nobody's trying to hurt you." "Then why does it feel exactly like being hurt?" I asked. He didn't reply. The silence on the line was long and heavy, the kind that tells you truth has already been heard and denied. "I love you," he said finally, and I almost believed him. "Then stop using that word as a leash," I said, and hung up. When I arrived in Chicago a month later, the city greeted me with its usual indifference. Steel and glass, wind and noise. The gallery was a converted warehouse, white walls, high ceilings, the smell of paint and possibility. My paintings looked different there, larger somehow, as if they had been waiting for this air. The night of the opening, the room was crowded with people whose clothes cost more than my first studio. Cameras flashed, voices buzzed, and everywhere I turned, someone was saying my name. But beneath the noise, I felt something quieter. The murmur of my younger self standing behind me, watching, half in awe, half in disbelief. Caldwell introduced me to critics and collectors, journalists and curators. I smiled, shook hands, said the expected things about gratitude and rediscovery. But when I stood before Fractured Woman, now hanging under perfect light, I couldn't help whispering to her under my breath, "They thought you were lost." So did I. After the opening, the press coverage was overwhelmingly positive. Words like visionary, trailblazer, pioneer appeared in headlines. My phone filled again with messages, but this time not from Daniel or Victoria. Strangers wrote to me from around the world, women especially, their notes filled with gratitude and envy and recognition. One wrote, "You've become what they said you couldn't, a woman who lived long enough to outlast her dismissal." I printed that one out and pinned it to my studio wall. But success doesn't end conflict. It magnifies it. Within 2 weeks, I received notice from a lawyer representing my son and his wife. They were contesting ownership of several of my paintings, claiming that since the works had been stored in their home for a period of years, they constituted shared property. It was absurd, but not surprising. I called my own lawyer, a quiet, efficient woman named Ruth, who handled the matter with the calm precision of someone used to male entitlement, dressed as legality. "This won't hold," she said after reading the claim. "It's a bluff." "I know," I said, "but let them bluff. Let them show how far they'll go." When the formal notice arrived at my door, I didn't cry. I didn't even curse. I simply sat at my table, reread the letter, and began drafting my own. One to my son, one to his wife, one final to the lawyer who had agreed to represent them. In the first, I told Daniel I understood that fear can make people cruel, but that I would not bend this time. In the second, to Victoria, I wrote only one sentence. "You mistook possession for love, and both will fail you." And in the third, the legal one, I wrote with the cold precision I had reserved all my life for brushwork. Any further attempt to appropriate my intellectual property will be treated as harassment under state law. I am of sound mind, of sound memory, and I remember everything. I signed my name slowly, deliberately, the ink spreading like blood through water. That night, I dreamed of the desert again. But this time the sand wasn't empty. It was blooming. Fields of yellow flowers rising from what had once been bare. When I woke, the dream clung to me like fragrance. I went to my easel and began painting before the kettle even boiled. I painted not the flowers, but the space between them, the breath of the wind moving through what once was barren. Every color I mixed felt like defiance, every line a refusal to disappear. I understood then that survival isn't the opposite of destruction. It's its evolution. You burn, you ash, and then you grow from your own remains. By the time the legal noise subsided, and it did, swiftly, after Ruth's quiet but firm response, I had finished 3 new canvases. They were different from anything I'd done before. Softer, more abstract, but also truer. When Caldwell saw them, he said they were the best work of my career. I smiled and told him they were the first ones I'd painted entirely for myself. What I didn't tell him was that they were also my reply to every betrayal that had come before, my declaration that nothing stolen can truly vanish if its maker remains alive to reclaim it. And so, the second escalation didn't end with defeat or triumph, but with clarity. I no longer painted to prove I existed. I painted because I knew I did. The morning of the hearing was clear and cruelly bright, the kind of day that insists on seeing everything, even what should remain private. I woke before dawn, my mind steady, my body humming with the quiet voltage of resolve. I had laid out my clothes the night before. A dark green wool dress, the one I'd worn to my husband's funeral decades ago, paired now with the velvet coat I had rescued from the back of my closet, the coat that had once smelled of turpentine and ambition. It still fit, though more tightly across the shoulders, as if time itself had grown heavier. I brushed my hair, pinned it back, and stared at my reflection. The woman who looked back at me wasn't nervous. She wasn't afraid. She was simply done. I brewed coffee but couldn't drink it. My hands were steady, but my heart moved with the slow, deliberate rhythm of something ancient remembering its purpose. The court was small, one of those neutral municipal buildings that smell faintly of paper and disinfectant. Ruth met me at the entrance, her folders tucked neatly under her arm. She was dressed in black and gray, her hair coiled with precision, her eyes calm and sharp. She didn't say much, only that it would be over quickly. "They won't win," she said, "but they'll try to wound you on the way down." I nodded. I already knew. I had spent a lifetime being wounded politely. We walked through metal detectors, down corridors lined with cheap art prints pretending to be soothing, and into a room where everything was too bright, the kind of brightness that flattens color and drains faces of warmth. Daniel was already there, sitting beside his lawyer. Victoria sat next to him, her expression composed, though her fingers twitched against the edge of the table like restless insects. She was dressed impeccably, as always, but her eyes darted toward me with a mixture of defiance and unease. I could tell she hadn't slept. Neither had I, but the difference was in the reason. I had stayed awake, preparing to reclaim my life, while she had stayed awake, fearing I actually would. The judge entered, and the room stood. She was a woman in her 60s, brisk, unsentimental, the kind of person who doesn't tolerate nonsense. When she began the session, the air itself seemed to tighten. Daniel's lawyer spoke first, a smooth-voiced man who addressed the court as if he were narrating a documentary on the fragility of family bonds. He framed their case as one of miscommunication and concern, emphasizing my age, my supposed vulnerability, and the family's desire to ensure her legacy is protected for future generations. He spoke of love as if it were a contract. I watched him without expression. Every word he said reminded me how easily men translate control into caretaking. When Ruth stood, her tone was quiet, precise, almost surgical. "My client," she said, "is not an artifact to be managed. She is a living artist whose authorship has been legally verified by multiple independent experts. The opposing party has benefited financially and reputationally from the unauthorized use of her property. What they describe as confusion is, in legal terms, misappropriation. What they call protection is, in plain language, exploitation." Her words fell into the air like measured blows. I didn't move, didn't nod, didn't look at Daniel or Victoria. I kept my gaze fixed on the judge, who listened with the impassive concentration of someone trained to separate emotion from evidence, though I could see in the tightening of her jaw that she understood more than she let on. When it was my turn to speak, Ruth placed a gentle hand on my arm. "Only if you want to," she whispered. But I did want to. I had spent my whole life being spoken for. It was time to use my own voice, even if it trembled. I stood, the weight of the room shifting toward me, and said, "I am 78 years old. I have painted since I was 15. My son and his wife took my work from my home without consent. They erased my name from it, sold it as anonymous, and profited from my invisibility. When the world recognized it as mine, they tried to claim it again under the guise of family interest. I have nothing left to lose but my name, and I am not giving it up." My voice didn't crack. It surprised even me. I saw the judge glance toward Daniel, whose jaw had tightened, and toward Victoria, who stared at her hands as though the truth might be written there if she looked hard enough. The proceeding didn't last long after that. The documents spoke for themselves. Photographs of exhibitions, correspondence with galleries, receipts, even a dated letter from a curator who had once rejected my work for being too feminine for public taste. Every proof of my authorship, every trace of my erasure, was laid out like a small resurrection. When the judge delivered her ruling, her words were firm and clean. Full ownership of the disputed works reverted to me, along with rights to any profits derived from their unauthorized sale. There was a formal reprimand issued to Daniel and Victoria for their actions, though it was couched in legal neutrality, misrepresentation, breach of trust. But the language didn't matter. What mattered was the sound it made, the quiet, satisfying click of something broken sliding back into place. When we left the courtroom, Ruth smiled faintly. "You did beautifully," she said. I thanked her and stepped out into the cold sunlight. The city hummed around me, indifferent but alive. I stood on the steps, letting the air fill my lungs until it almost hurt. For the first time in years, I felt the full weight of my name resting in my hands, not as burden, but as inheritance. Something I had built, lost, and built again. I thought I might cry, but no tears came. Some victories are too vast for weeping. That evening, I returned home to find an envelope slipped under my door. The handwriting was Daniel's. Inside was a single sheet of paper with only a few words. "I'm sorry. I thought I was helping. I didn't know how to be your son without owning part of you." I read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer where I keep my paint rags. Forgiveness, I realized, is not always a gift to the other person. Sometimes it's a way of setting down a stone you no longer wish to carry. I didn't forgive him entirely, but I stopped needing to. The next morning, I went into my studio before the sun rose. The air was cool and smelled faintly of dust and linseed oil. On the easel stood a blank canvas, taller than I was, stretched so tight it looked ready to sing. I mixed my paints slowly, deliberately, letting the colors form without rush. I didn't plan the composition. I simply began. The brush moved with a certainty I hadn't felt in decades. I painted not images, but impressions, color bleeding into color, a rhythm of becoming. As the hours passed, a shape began to emerge. Not a woman this time, but a field of fractured light, a pattern of brightness held together by tension. It looked like something breaking and healing at once. I didn't stop until the room had shifted from morning to afternoon, until my arms ached and my heart felt both emptied and full. When I finally stepped back, the canvas glowed. It wasn't beautiful in the conventional sense. It was raw, unsettling, alive. I titled it Inheritance. It was everything I had been trying to say all my life, condensed into color and silence. That night, I wrote to Caldwell, telling him I wanted the piece to close the Chicago exhibition. "It's my last," I wrote, though I didn't know if that was true. He replied within the hour, "It's your beginning." 2 days later, I attended the closing reception of the show. The gallery was dimmer this time, quieter, the crowd smaller but more reverent. Inheritance hung at the center, commanding attention without needing to demand it. When I approached it, people stepped aside. I stood there, surrounded by the low murmur of admiration, and realized that the painting wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to the air, to the eyes that found themselves reflected in it. For a moment, I felt the years dissolve. The young woman who had painted in secret, the middle-aged mother who had packed away her canvases to make room for others, the old woman who had been called a dusty relic. They all stood with me, not ghosts, but witnesses. As I left the gallery, the night was cold and clean. The city lights shimmered on wet pavement, and in each reflection, I saw fragments of color, green, gold, violet, the hues of persistence. I walked without hurry, my breath rising in small clouds. The world didn't owe me recognition. It had already given me something rarer, the chance to return to myself. And that, I thought, was the real climax. Not the courtroom, not the applause, not even the painting's brilliance, but the quiet certainty that I had crossed the last threshold of fear. When I reached home, the apartment felt different, larger somehow. I turned on the lamp and saw my reflection in the window. Not diminished, not triumphant, simply whole. I sat down, took off my coat, and let the silence fill the room. Then I whispered to no one in particular. They called me a relic, but relics outlast their thieves. The months that followed passed with a gentleness I had not known in decades. The noise subsided, the calls slowed, and even the press, so eager to romanticize my resurgence, moved on to the next rediscovery. Fame is brief, but dignity, once reclaimed, endures like stone. The Chicago exhibition closed with quiet reverence. The last night I stood in the gallery alone after everyone had gone. The lights dimmed, the smell of wine and dust lingering in the air. I remember touching the edge of inheritance with the tips of my fingers, not to test the texture, but to reassure myself that it was real, that I had not imagined the entire thing. For so long I had been painted out of the picture of my own life. Now I stood at its center, unposed, unframed, alive. The painting was purchased by a women's museum that promised to preserve it as part of a permanent collection. I didn't negotiate the price. I told Caldwell to sell it for whatever he thought fair, and when he asked where to send the check, I told him to donate it to scholarships for women over 50 who had once studied art and stopped. I wanted the money to move forward, not circle back. When I returned to Santa Fe, the desert greeted me like an old friend who had been waiting quietly all this time. The air was still, the horizon infinite. I unpacked slowly, placing my brushes back where they belonged, setting the remaining canvases against the wall. The house smelled of sunlight and turpentine again, the familiar scent of work and solitude. I began painting small things, shadows of leaves on the wall, the curve of a hand, the way dawn light pools unevenly across the floor. These were not works for galleries or collectors. They were for me alone, quiet conversations with the self I had finally met. I had spent a lifetime painting to be seen. Now I painted to see. Daniel came once in early spring. He didn't call first, perhaps fearing I would say no. I heard his car outside, the hesitant knock that followed. When I opened the door, he stood there in jeans and a soft sweater, looking smaller somehow, less sure of his place in the world. He carried no wine this time, only a framed photograph of Kieran holding one of my old sketchbooks. "He wanted you to have this," Daniel said, his voice uncertain. I invited him in. We sat in silence for a while, the distance between us filled with the ghosts of every conversation we hadn't had. Finally, he said, "I read the articles. I didn't realize how much they took from you. How much I did." I told him I knew. He looked down at his hands. "I thought I was protecting you. I see now I was protecting myself from feeling small next to you." It was a strange kind of confession, quiet but sincere. I didn't absolve him. I simply reached across the table and touched his hand. Forgiveness, I've learned, doesn't always mean returning to what was. It means loosening the hold of what still hurts. After he left, I sat for a long time looking at the photograph. Kieran's smile reminded me of Daniel's when he was a boy, unguarded, curious, unshaped by pride. I thought of writing him a letter, but instead I began another painting. A small canvas of 3 generations' hands overlapping, fading into one another like watercolors. When it was done, I titled it Continuance and sent it to him with no note. Some truths don't need language. The rest of that year passed in the rhythm of days both ordinary and sacred. I walked more, cooked more, listened to the desert. Sometimes strangers still wrote to me, women who had read about my story and wanted to thank me for coming back. I always smiled at that phrase. I never left. I was only quiet. When they asked for advice, I told them the same thing. Don't wait for permission to exist. Time doesn't owe you space. You take it, and then you fill it. A few of them visited me, young artists carrying sketchbooks in fear, their eyes wide with the hunger of beginning. I fed them coffee and stories, not the polished kind the magazines printed, but the raw ones. The loneliness, the humiliation, the small triumphs that don't make headlines. They listened the way I once listened to silence, hoping to hear themselves inside it. On the first anniversary of the exhibition, I received a parcel from Caldwell. Inside was a slim catalog of my retrospective, bound in cream linen, the pages thick and matte. On the first page he had written, "To Martha Ellison, who proved that creation is not youth's privilege, but its continuation." I ran my hand over the words and closed the book. It was beautiful, but it was not the proof I needed anymore. Proof is for those who doubt. I had outlived my doubters. That evening, as twilight gathered outside, I poured myself a glass of wine and stood by the window. The desert stretched out before me, vast and silent. The same landscape I had painted 1,000 times, but never truly seen until now. The wind rose, carrying the scent of sage, and I thought of all the women I had been, the dreamer, the wife, the mother, the ghost, the relic, the artist reborn. They were not separate. They were chapters of the same breath. I whispered to them, "We made it," and in the stillness, I almost heard them whisper back. Later, before bed, I took the newspaper clipping from the drawer, the first one, the article that had started my rediscovery. I read it one last time and then tore it neatly down the middle. I wasn't erasing the past. I was releasing it. I slipped the pieces into the wastebasket, turned off the lamp, and sat in the darkness. The silence felt kind now, like a room that finally fits the body inside it. I don't know how much longer I will live, and for the first time, that uncertainty doesn't frighten me. I've already returned once from oblivion. I know the path. I think sometimes of the young woman who painted Fractured Woman all those years ago. Her hands trembling. Her heart a wound. If she could see me now, she would smile, not because I was celebrated, but because I had survived the slow erasure that devours so many women before they are gone. She would see that the fracture was never a flaw. It was the opening through which the light entered. And so, this is the calm after the long storm, the final brushstroke on a canvas that began half a century ago. My story doesn't end with applause or bitterness, but with quiet presence. I am here, still painting, still breathing, still becoming. The dust they thought would bury me has turned to gold in the evening light. And if another woman ever finds this story, wondering whether her silence will last forever, I hope she hears my voice somewhere beneath her doubt, steady and certain. They can take your name, your art, your place, but not the seeing. The seeing is yours, always yours.